let us start this class. Now, in our previous class, we were discussing Anglo Saxon heroic poetry. We had started, and I had been discussing with you. I discussed with Seth. Then we moved on to Beowulf. I told you an outline of the story, as you can find it here, and how Beowulf, as the leader of the Geats, he visits Denmark and helps King Hrothgar to get rid of this monster Grendel and Grendel's mother. So later on he becomes the king of the Geats himself, and he has a glorious reign of 50 years. And as you can see, that later on in his years, when he is an old man, there is this fire-breathing dragon which starts to disturb his kingdom, and he has to fight this dragon. And ultimately, though he is able to kill this dragon, he is himself killed. So his reign comes to an end with that. Now let us move on to the next slide, where we will sort of make an analysis of this story, this epic as it is called in Anglo-Saxon poetry. As we know that Beowulf has been called an epic by different critics. Now, what do we see in Beowulf? What is reflected in Beowulf in this poem? It is, of course, the ethical values of the Germanic people. These are manifest, or these can be seen in the Germanic code of loyalty to the chief and the tribe, and vengeance to enemies. So when any Germanic tribe was, of course, as I had mentioned earlier, that there were different leaders of different Germanic tribes, kings or leaders, who had these bands of followers or soldiers who fought for them, and they were, of course, bound by this very strong ties of loyalty and allegiance to the leader, and so it was their task to help him during times of war. So Beowulf also shows this, how Beowulf, as a kind of at first when he is a young hero, he is sent by his uncle, King Hygelac, to Denmark, and as a kind of a subject and a nephew of King Hygelac, he goes to Denmark and he fights there. And later on, when he himself becomes the king, how his followers, they rally behind him, though in the last struggle against the fire dragon, most of his followers desert him. Only Wiglaf remains. Now, the poem, though there are Germanic elements, all these elements are there, the chivalry, the kind of courageous behavior, the heroic qualities that characterize the Germanic heroes. The poem is so infused with a Christian spirit that it lacks the grim fatality of many of the Eddaic lays or the sagas of Icelandic literature. So actually it has a kind of a spiritual or religious or Christian element infused into it. And these elements were inserted, or these were sort of incorporated into the poem later on. And many of the Icelandic sagas, the Eddaic lays that were which concerned these heroes, these Viking heroes, from Iceland, Norway, or Sweden. So these actually resemble Beowulf in the sense of grim fatalism, but the sense of fatalism that life, hero's life is doomed to he's doomed to die in the end. So that is sort of kind of mitigated or lessened by this Christian spirit that is very much present here, because Beowulf as a hero, he shows some of the Christian qualities of mercy, compassion, and all that. Now, Beowulf himself seems more altruistic than other Germanic heroes or the ancient Greek heroes of the Iliad. You will find when we study the Iliad, which is in your CC2 paper, the ancient Greek heroes who are represented there in the Iliad by Homer, they are very different. And here, Beowulf seems more altruistic. He is sort of more bent on, or he is more interested in serving his people, his subjects, than the other Germanic heroes who are more, perhaps some of them are quite cruel in nature, and they are very stern and like that, but Beowulf is somewhat different from them. It is significant that his 3 battles are not against men, which would entail the retaliation of the blood feud, but against evil monsters, enemies of the whole community and of civilization itself. So the 3 battles that he fights, of course, they are against monsters. They are not against any human heroes or human opponents. And it would have been different if he had fought against human enemies. And it could have led to the blood feud. Now this concept of the blood feud, feud means a struggle or a quarrel. So these were some of the you'll find some of the themes of different Germanic lays or poems, where this blood feud took an important shape. And it started with a family being wronged by another family, by a person from a different family, and then the son of the person who has been killed, he kills someone from he kills the person who has killed his father. So, and then again it continues. So it is like that. So that is the blood feud that sometimes we find in Germanic poems. But these evil monsters who are portrayed, they are supposed to represent evil in extreme forms. So in a sense, it becomes the struggle between good and evil. So Beowulf, of course, stands for the good hero who is present, who has come in order to rescue the kingdom of the Danes, to help King Hrothgar and rescue them from this evil monster Grendel and his mother. So it is different. So these monsters are portrayed, they are presented as sort of primeval enemies, and they are enemies of the whole community and of civilization itself, as you can well understand. And they are the creatures of the night because they come in the night, and of course they belong to the outer darkness, which are and their forces which are against harmony and all the merrymaking, joy and laughter that is prevalent in Heorot. So it is mentioned in the poem in Beowulf that Grendel attacked Heorot and Hrothgar's men because he could not bear the sound of merrymaking, the sound of the minstrels singing. So the song did not appeal to Grendel, and he was irritated by these songs, and that is why he was provoked by these songs, and he attacked the hall of King Hrothgar. So as we see that now many critics have seen this poem Beowulf as a kind of a Christian allegory, and with Beowulf the champion of goodness and light against the forces of evil and darkness. So it is a kind of an allegory where all the good virtues of Christianity are prevailing. So the representation of the abstract virtues in human form. So ultimately, when he dies fighting the dragon, the fire-breathing dragon, it is a kind of a sacrifice. So his sacrificial death is not seen as tragic. So it is not tragic in that sense, but as the fitting end of a good hero's life. So he has been a very good king. He has been a king for 50 long years, for half a century. And how he has governed his kingdom, how well he has governed his kingdom. So that is, of course, comes to the fore. His heroic qualities, his kingly qualities, his kindness, his benevolence for his subjects. So these are emphasized by the poet, and the Christian virtues, all these are emphasized. And that is why some critics have called this poem a kind of a Christian allegory. So as you can see that in the second half of the poem, in the first half, of course, Beowulf becomes victorious against these two monsters. He comes back to Gateland, and he is, of course, welcomed by his uncle. But in the second half of the story, the poem, we find that he becomes the king himself, and how he lives up to the expectations, and how well he governs his subjects. So there is, between the first part of the poem and the second part of the poem, a division of 50 years, a kind of a period which is not described, what Beowulf has done during this time. So whether he has been able to win any battles against any other enemy, or what he has done, what was his achievement during this period. So we do not know that. The poet does not tell us anything about this intervening period of 50 years. But he takes us right to the end of Beowulf's career as a king, and ultimately to his the description of his death against this fire-breathing dragon. So his death is the climax of the poem, and the tragic resolution, of course, follows. Beowulf is personally courageous, and he wins the final battle at the cost of his life. And as we see that one of the messengers, he foretells that ultimately the Geatish kingdom will be dissolved, it will be destroyed, and there would be invasions from from other forces, other tribes. So of course the final words about Beowulf are that he is the greatest of heroes. So the poet sort of extols or praises his achievements as a hero. And he is also not only the greatest of the heroes, but also the gentlest, the man who has achieved fame and honor. So, and glory, fame, honor, and glory, which the Anglo Saxons they valued immensely, as we had seen the what they stood for. The Anglo Saxons valued this sense of honor and dignity and courage. So everything that was good, they stood for that. So death that comes to Beowulf is, of course, it would come to every hero, and it is ultimately something that cuts him off. But though his death is portrayed in a kind of in a way where all his companions they lament his death, his subjects they also lament his death, but he becomes a kind of a tragic hero, and his virtues are emphasized when he dies. So in this sense, as we can see that Beowulf, the importance of Beowulf, why should we look upon Beowulf as a great specimen of Anglo-Saxon, a kind of a poem which gives us the sort of, a reflection of Germanic life of the times. So that is what it is, we can see here. So I'll give you certain notes on certain other aspects of the poem. For example, why or whether Beowulf can be called an epic, or the blend of Christian and pagan elements. There are some other, the character of the hero, how he is portrayed. So these questions are sometimes they are set. But let us, for the time being, let us go to the next poem, which is Waldhere. Waldhere or Waldere. So it's written in both ways, both the spellings are correct. Now this poem is another short fragment. As you know that most of the Anglo-Saxon poems are fragments, they are not whole poems. The beginning and end is lost of many poems, and it is this poem consists of two fragments of about 60 odd lines, around 63 lines, and it dates around 1000 AD. So the Waldere fragments, they sometimes referred to as Waldere. Now they are two fragments of an Old English poem that revolves around the legendary king Walter of Aquitaine. And Walter of Aquitaine was a kind of a mythical kind of a king, a legendary Germanic king, and this person is synonymous with Waldere, and he is held prisoner by Attila the Hun. So we heard about, we know about Attila the Hun from the poem Widsith, that Widsith had, of course, visited certain kings. The poem was rediscovered in 1860 by the chief librarian Dr. E.C. Werloff at the Royal Library in Copenhagen, and only had 15 lines. Then it was found. It is thought that the original fragment could contain upwards of over 1000 lines and could have been as long as Beowulf. So here it could have been said that it was thought that it was part of a much longer poem, this poem Waldhere, where how Waldhere and his betrothed bride Hildgund, they sort of escaped. So that is now what is this story about? So the fragments, these two fragments, can be situated in the epic of which they form part, because the subject or the adventures surrounding the hero Walter of Aquitaine is known in other texts. Now, this story has been recounted. It has been told in other texts also during the time or a little bit earlier. There is a Latin epic poem called Waltharius, and this poem was written by a saint, a kind of a monk called Eckehard of the Abbey of St. Gall, and it dates from the first half of the 10th century. And there are also fragments of a Bavarian poem dating from the first half of the 13th century. And there are 2 episodes in the Norwegian POETRY2 saga. So these are all references to the world here that we find in Middle High German poems, and there is also a Polish version of the story. So as you see, during the Germanic in the continent, there are many stories which concern this king, this hero, Walter of Aquitaine, and they continue to be, they were written in many languages. They were written in German, they were written in Polish, and also in Latin, the epic poem which is termed Waltharius. So this particular Anglo-Saxon poem, World, here has been sort of a continuation. It has been derived from all these sources. So these are all the sources of this poem, and this particular poem, it reflects the elements that are recounted here, though it is a fragment, as we can see. It is not a whole poem, but we can reconstruct the story because we have at our disposal these the other poems which were found. So the poem, the theme of the poem is that there is this person called Walter or Walter, and his betrothed bride Hildegith or Hildgund, and the poem actually is a proof that the Anglo-Saxon people had any knowledge of the legend of Walter of Aquitaine. So the Anglo-Saxons, they were aware of this story of Walter of Aquitaine, and this was a very popular story in the Middle Ages, and therefore there were so many versions available of this story. So it is the story of Walder or Walter, as he is called, and Hildegith, who fall in love and steal treasure from the court of Attila, where they were held hostage. So Attila the Hun was this very cruel ruler, and he kept them hostage, and then they managed to steal some treasure from his court. Walder and Hildegith are sought out by 2 men, Guthfer, who is the king of the Burgundians, and Hagina. So they are actually the kind of opponents of Walter. These 2 men are after the treasure that Walder and Hildegith possess. So they want the treasure. So there is a fight. The poem is about the conflict that is about to take place between the 2 parties. So as you know, that Old English heroic poems, they recount the stories of battles, fights that have taken place. And this story also is about this fight between Walter on the one hand and these 2 men. So as you can see, this is a fragment, but the story is recounted in this poem. Now let us come to the another fragment, the fight at Finnsburg, and this is even a shorter one, about 48 lines long, only about 48 lines. And here we find that there is a reference to the Finn episode in Beowulf. In Beowulf, there are many digressions. Digressions in the sense that sometimes the minstrel is singing about or talking about the episodes which deal with different heroes, other than what had happened at the court of King Hrothgar or King Hygelac or about with what happened to Beowulf. So he has recounted about other fights and small kingdoms. For example, the Finns, the tribe of the Finns, the Finn episode. It presents a part of what must have been a series of stories about the Danish-Frisian conflict. So the conflict between the Danish people and the Frisians. Now here, the poem as we have it, that is Fight at Finnsburg, the poem recounts an earlier stage in the hostilities where the Frisians attacked Naf. The Naf and his band of 60 Danes had been paying a visit to Naf's sister Queen Hildebard and her husband King Finn. So Naf was the leader of the Danes, and King Finn was the leader of the Frisians. And Naf's sister Queen Hildebard was married to King Finn, so they were sort of related in this way. And Naf's body is attacked by the Frisians in the night. Suddenly, the watchman who is keeping vigil, he sees that a number of burning torches, moshal, so these are coming from the distance. This can be seen, and he then rouses the other warriors, and 60 men, including King Finn, including Naf, they start to prepare for the fight. So the beginning of the fragment is missing. We do not have the beginning, and it begins abruptly with a sentinel for the Danes spotting the glittering swords as the treacherous attack is about to be launched. So the sentinel or the guard, he spots the moonlight or the light of the burning torches which are reflected on the glittering swords which the Frisians are carrying, and the Frisians are about to launch an attack on these Danes. And so as we can see that this poem actually is another fragment, and the beginning of this poem is missing, and the speech that is delivered, that forms the poem. So in that sense, so now the emphasis, the style of the fragment, the emphasis and style of the fragment are quite different from those of the episode and from the epic Beowulf. This poem is not a curtailed epic but a real lay, which is a brief narrative with compressed description and rapid conversation. So though this is only about 48 to 50 lines long, and the beginning and the end is lost, still the style is different. The reference in Beowulf যে রেফারেন্সটা আছে ফিন এপিসোডের, that is a different episode altogether, and this is also a different episode which is not which you do not find in Beowulf. So the tone is of course a kind of an exhortation is sort of there. The speaker exhorts the warriors, the Danish warriors, to get up and prepare themselves for the fight, because the Frisians are approaching them, and it is going to be a fight. There is going to be a fight. So all these small poems, as you know, as you can see, Waldhere, then the fight at Finnsburg. Now these actually they show the sort of the Anglo-Saxon society, the Anglo-Saxon ethos of loyalty, courage, and all that is all the qualities, the characteristics which are reflected in these poems. Actually, this poem was not so short a poem, but it is now a kind of a curtailed or shortened poem, because only we have the middle part, and that too only about 50 lines. So what happens in the end, that is unknown. We do not know what ultimately happened to Nath and his followers, whether they were able to ward off these Frisians. Now let us come to the two later poems, the Battle of Brunanburh and the Battle of Maldon. Now these are later war poems which fall into the category of Anglo-Saxon heroic poems. Now the Battle of Brunanburh is a chronicle poem which appears as the entry for the year 937 in 4 manuscripts of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, when we will be studying Anglo-Saxon prose, we will be doing the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, we will be talking about it. It is a kind of a running narrative of the different events that happened during the Anglo-Saxon times. King Alfred was the ruler who sort of revived the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and under him it was refurbished. Now the Battle of Brunanburh is mentioned there under the year 937. It is a panegyric. A panegyric is a piece of writing praising somebody or something on the heroism of King Ethelstan and his young brother Eadmund. Eadmund was only 16 at the time of this battle, which is being celebrated in this poem. Now these grandsons of Alfred the Great, so who were they? They were the grandsons of Alfred, defeated and put to flight near Brunanburh the combined forces of King Constantine II of Scotland, King Eugenius of the Strathclyde Britons, and Anlaf, son of the Viking king of Dublin. So this was the fight between these two kings, rather the King Ethelstan and his young brother Edmund, and the forces which arrived from Scotland, the Strathclyde Britons, and from Ireland, which is modern Ireland, as you know, the Viking king of Dublin, which was under the Viking rule at that time. So a victory is being celebrated in this poem, and to the Old English poet, this victory was the most glorious occasion in English history. The panoramic sweep of the poem may not bring us face to face with individual heroes, but it admirably suggests the heroic virtues embodied in their actions. So it has been described in a kind of a very large sweep on it, with a large area it is being described, but individual heroes as such, they are not named, only these people are named, but the heroic virtues, of course, are emphasized. This poem thus shows strong patriotic sentiment. So it was a victory for the English forces against the foreign forces from Scotland, Ireland, and from the Strathclyde Britons. The victory is regarded as a victory of the English forces against Norse, that is Viking, Scots and Welsh enemies. Strathclyde Britons means from Wales, which is now modern Wales. And though the heroism of Ethelstan and Eadmund is celebrated, the two princes not as heroes in their own right, so much as champions of their nation. They are, of course, they emerge as great Anglo-Saxon heroes as such, but also they are the champions of their nation, England. So they protect, they are the protectors of England as a whole, because they save England from being overrun by the combined forces of these three enemies. So it is a patriotic kind of a feeling that is expressed in this particular poem. The Battle of Brunanburh is thus a celebration of a victory. And in this way, it is important. It is one of the older, later Anglo Saxon heroic poems. The other one is the Battle of Maldon, which is different in tone, quite different in tone from the Battle of Brunanburh. So, this is the significance, that it is upholding the sentiments of the English people, how this king Aethelstan and his young brother, they sort of emerge as champions of the Anglo-Saxon race. And now, lastly, we would go to the last poem, the Battle of Maldon. So, the Battle of Maldon, it is the last poem that we'll be considering, which falls within the category of Anglo-Saxon heroic poems. And here it appears also in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle under the date 991. So, the Battle of Brunanburh appeared under the date 937, and this is appearing a little later, 991. The beginning and the end of the poem is missing. So, again, as we see, as is quite common in case of the other Anglo-Saxon poems, as we saw, the beginning of the poem often is missing, the end also is missing, and in this particular poem also we find the same thing has occurred. This is a poem of 325 lines, and this is a narrative having Homeric grandeur and vigor. So, it deals, what does it deal with? It deals with one of the many clashes between the English and the Danes that resulted from the latter's attack on England. So, from the time of King Alfred, or even before that, the Danes had been attacking England. They were coming in different batches, and they had been attacking England. And this is a poem which recounts one of the many battles that were fought against them, against the Danes by the English. The poem represents the English army, specifically the Essex Field under the leadership of the old Earl Byrhtnoth, drawn up against the Viking invaders along the Blackwater estuary called the Panta. So, actually, Feed is a kind of a legion of warriors, a small legion of warriors. So, Byrhtnoth, now these names are very kind of complex names, and as I told you, these are Anglo-Saxon names which are quite unfamiliar to you. So, you have to note the spellings carefully. Byrhtnoth, that is he is the leader of this English army in this poem. And he is fighting the Viking invaders who comes into England. The poem is a story of the disastrous English defeat. So, contrasted with the Battle of Brunanburh, which is dealing with the English victory, this is concerned with English defeat. In this battle, Byrhtnoth, who led the English forces, fought and died in a courageous attempt to thwart the Danes. Thwart means to prevent the Danes from coming over, from occupying their lands. So, Byrhtnoth becomes a martyr here in this fight against the Danes. The poem contains 9 speeches. So, as you can see, it is mostly made up of speeches. It is only about 325 lines, and there are 9 speeches in the poem, mostly of exhortation and encouragement to the English forces, and are delivered by 7 different speakers. So, there are many warriors. Of course, Byrhtnoth is the leader, but under him there are certain warriors who are fighting under him. As we know that the warriors, they always rallied behind their leaders, as was the case with all Anglo-Saxon tribes. So here also the same thing happens. They do not desert their leader, Byrhtnoth, who dies fighting. The passionate loyalty of the warriors to their chief is eloquently presented. So this again, this virtue of loyalty, this virtue of loyalty. They are passionate about their leader. They are always fighting for their leader. It is eloquently presented. It is very beautifully presented in the many speeches that we find here. So it is a poem of exhortation. Exhortation means to sort of encourage someone to do something. If one is sort of feels kind of hopeless, one doesn't really know how to rouse oneself from a sense of feeling of melancholy, sadness, then one might exhort someone to just get up and fight. So though they knew that perhaps defeat was coming, still they did not leave the battlefield, or they did not leave the leader. Now, so it is eloquently presented, and the tone of desperate courage against hopeless odds becomes more and more intense as the poem proceeds to culminate in the death of Byrhtnoth. So ultimately, the warriors understand that it is hopeless to fight against these Viking invaders. So they are much more powerful, and they would become victorious, and ultimately Byrhtnoth is killed. And the high strain in which his old retainer, Byrhtnoth, so Byrhtnoth is one of the retainers, one of the followers, one of the soldiers, an old soldier who is fighting under the leadership of Byrhtnoth. So these spellings, just keep in mind. He narrates the death of the old king. He describes how the old king Byrhtnoth died fighting, and can be said to make fitting conclusions to the heroic tone of Old English poetry. So the speech that he delivers towards the end of the poem, and ultimately he also dies fighting against these invaders. These oft quoted lines sum up the way of life of the Anglo-Saxon warriors. So the line that is it is quite famous, and in the whole poem, this line, it is often quoted. You will find this line in Albert also, perhaps, or in other history of English literature books. Quote, mind must be stronger, heart the braver, courage must be the greater as our strength dwindles, unquote. So dwindles, it means it becomes less and less. And as we see that Byrhtnoth, what is he doing here? He is exhorting. This is the exhortation. This is the encouragement. He is encouraging his small band of warriors to be strong, mentally strong, and not to lose heart. So be courageous, be brave, be resolute in the face of these onslaughts or attacks. So our strength is dwindling, our strength is lessening as the time passes by, but we must not leave the battlefield. So as we saw that when we were reading the characteristics, what were the characteristics of the Anglo-Saxon people, they preferred to lay down their lives in battles rather than become a coward by fleeing from the battlefield. So they preferred death to dishonor. So that was a kind of something that we will find in these poems. We will find this in Beowulf. We will find when, for example, in Beowulf, when Beowulf is fighting this fire-breathing dragon, and many of his companions they have deserted him, and there is Wiglaf who remains by Beowulf's side, and then he sort of castigates these fleeing companions who are escaping, who are trying to desert Beowulf. So he really kind of rebukes them, as it can be said. So this really rounds up, this sums up what we have in terms of Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry. And so these are some of the poems. They're not very, as you know, not very big in number, just 4 or 5 poems. So these are just, you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 poems in fact. So if when Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry is mentioned, we'll have to mention these poems, and Beowulf of course will be the primary focus, our primary focus, because for the obvious reason of its length. It is a very long poem. Its epical qualities, the qualities which sort of distinguishes it from the other poems. And the last two poems are also important, as they are showing how even towards the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, as you know that the Anglo-Saxon period came to an end in 1066 with the Battle of Hastings, when William of Normandy, he emerged victorious, and the Anglo-Norman conquest, the Norman conquest as it is called, it occurred. So 991 means it's towards the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, and 937 also very near it. So even during the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, the heroic ethos, the heroic qualities, they were still the same. What it was like earlier in Beowulf, what we find there in Waldhere or the fight at Finsburg, it is very similar. So here we let us end this presentation, and I'll stop presenting. So do you find any do you have any questions? কোনো প্রশ্ন আছে, কিছু অসুবিধা হয়েছে বুঝতে কিছু? তাহলে